Welcome to the Real News. I'm Mark Steiner. Good to have you with us. I Got a Monster: The Rise and Fall of America's Most Corrupt Police Squad is the title of a book about a violent, corrupt, criminal band of Baltimore City police officers by Baynard and Brandon Soderberg. The book comes at a propitious moment as we witness the increasing calls for police abolition and defunding police departments across the country because of the brutality and violence against Black people, people of color, and in poor communities. This is an important book, written like a gripping novel you can't put down. It looks at one of the most violent, blatantly corrupt police departments in the country, the Baltimore City Police, with a tale that is literally a lesson for why police reform is not enough and why things must radically change, not just in Baltimore, but around the country. Baynard and Brandon Soderberg both live in Baltimore. They worked together on the Baltimore City paper when it was alive. They covered the uprising after Freddie Gray died at police custody. Baynard covered criminal justice and protests for The Guardian. His work has appeared in the New York Times and many other national papers. Brandon Soderberg is a former contributing writer for Spin magazine, writing about the intersection of hip-hop and politics. His work has been in Vice and many numerous journals as well. And they both wrote an incredible op-ed piece for Washington Post, which we'll talk about in the context of this book that just came out. And for full disclosure, we are colleagues and friends. Disclosure is important. Welcome, guys. Good to have you with us.
Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So, who wants to begin this? I want to get, just for the viewer who are unfamiliar with Baltimore City and unfamiliar with this, but may not be unfamiliar with the corruption of police, how this sojourn began for the two of you. Baynard, why don't you jump off?
Yeah, I mean, we were both working at Baltimore City Paper in 2014 when one of the officers who was charged in this case, Daniel Herschel, was prosecuting going after and hassling a rapper named Young Moose. And he used a rap video to get probable cause to raid Moose's house. A judge signed off on that. A probation officer had locked him back up for it so that he would miss a show he was supposed to perform at the Baltimore Arena with Boozy. And so it was going to be a big thing in Moose's career. And Herschel was trying to take it down. And so we began coming into it. We were both arts reporters mainly at the time, and we were coming into it looking at the way that a work of art was being used as evidence in a criminal case, and that seemed like a huge First Amendment violation to us. And since then, we started to realize the massive Fourth Amendment violations that are in the Baltimore Police Department engages in all the time. But that was really our D. Watkins, first sort of writer here in Baltimore, kind of tipped us to that story, and we really started digging into that. And over the years, Moose and his family communicated with us and would say, hey, they just broke into our safe. They just came and arrested us. And so we were able to keep track of the story. And then on March 1st of 2017, we see that there was an indictment, and Herschel was one of 7 cops who were indicted that day. And he was one of the least bad of them. And so that was really a shocker.
The least bad. So
one of the least bad.
One of the least bad. so Brandon, I mean, I pick up there, and I just, as this thing unfolded, and this guy who is one of the major protagonists, Sergeant Wayne Jenkins, comes to light. I'm curious about how that came to light for you and what began to unfold.
So yeah, as Baynard said, we were really focused on Herschel because he was who we knew and what we had heard a lot about. We kept hearing more things about him. And so for us, the story started as a dirty cop story that we felt ready to write about and report out. But when the indictment happened on March 1st, 2017, we realized that it was not a dirty cop story. It was a sort of criminal gang of cops story, which Herschel was one of 7. The leader of this kind of criminal gang, which was the unit was called the Gun Trace Task Force, kind of a gun seizing unit, plainclothes police unit. The leader of that unit was Sergeant Wayne Jenkins, who was sort of all of our stories of police corruption and dirty cops rolled into one person and then some. And so what was revealed in the indictment was that Jenkins with this squad was frequently robbing people, stealing money, stealing drugs, dealing drugs, and just violating people's rights constantly, all the while also stealing a ton of overtime from the city. So stealing from the taxpayers as well. This is what the federal indictment showed. And this was and it was a criminal conspiracy within the police department. And so that's where it really started. And then as we dug deeper into it, you started to see these really, really just heinous anecdotes of police corruption, police robberies, like where the policing there wasn't even the pretense of policing sometimes. And the most extreme example of that is they kidnapped a couple who they got a tip, the man of the couple had a gun. They kidnapped this couple, took them to their house, and then robbed them for about a lot of money, and then didn't even charge them with anything. And so that's kind of the kind of details you started to learn through the indictment. We started to just dig into that. And then in January 2018, two of the cops, including Herschel, as well as Marcus Taylor, were the only two that didn't plead guilty of the initial 7. And so there was a trial for them, a federal trial. And at that trial, it was sort of just every day was another crazy story of corruption and drug dealing and malfeasance within the department. And you sort of start to see how big it was because so many other officers were named. There's kind of a running list we all had of other cops that were implicated directly or indirectly. And that's when we started to realize that this was a bigger story and it was a book.
It was a book, and it is a book. So Baynard, neither you nor Brandon are naive men. So I'm curious. Tell a bit of the story about how what unfolded for you in terms of the depth of corruption, what these men were really capable of doing, and how shocked or not shocked you were by it.
Yeah, I mean, so as you mentioned, I'd been covering Baltimore police specifically for The Guardian during the time that the book is set, during 2016, and covered all of the trials in the Freddie Gray case, was covering police at the time of the trial, was covering police for The Real News. And so I've been looking into police misconduct, and there's plenty of examples here. There's so many examples going back, decades. But I mean, and you helped us talk about some of the older cases and stuff. But when we were sitting in the trial, the kinds of things that we heard just were more and more shocking. From the smaller details of like little heists that they would do to big details like faking body camera footage or faking phone footage to rob someone's safe. They stole $100,000 from someone. They broke the safe, took it out, reclosed the safe, filmed them opening it again, and then arrested the guy. And especially it was powerful hearing directly from the victims who had been robbed, had been illegally detained, had been, in one case, they took a guy's phone. They started texting back with his girlfriend, trying to get information when she wouldn't give information, trying to get nude pics, acting like they were him. And just doing these just petty and horrible things to like mastermind massive things that it was constant. And while we had no illusions about police before this started, I don't think either of us had any sense of especially Wayne Jenkins. It's a strange thing to write about because on the one hand, these people are the outgrowth of policing in a natural way. But Wayne Jenkins really is an extraordinary criminal also. And the others get swept up in that in different ways. But the deviousness with the double crosses of his own squad and the triple crosses was really just, was astounding. And now I don't know how I could ever believe something like a statement of probable cause, even in vague outline again.
So one of the things also that struck me, a couple of things is that in the book was the sheer callousness they had towards other human beings in the cities, and the numbers of people that went to prison through their illegal activities because of what they did illegally to people, whether or not they were involved in a drug trade or whatever that was, is a question to the side. The question is what they did in a corrupt, violent way to send people to prison illegally. And the massive numbers of people, should be mind-boggling to people who read this book and get a sense of just how deep it is and how high the corruption goes. I mean, that's the thing that really struck me. I think more than anything else, Brandon. It was just like I wasn't shocked by it either, having known cops like this my entire life. But there was just something about what you exposed and how you exposed it. And what it did to people's lives, I think, is just astounding.
Yeah, one example of it would just be we'd speak to victims, and we kind of the stories would be, where were you when you heard that these cops that had ruined your life were, had been indicted, and we talked to enough people that you started to realize there was like multiple people in multiple jails that all had the same experience on that day, that they looked up at the TV in the rec room and saw these cops on the screen and were like, those guys did it to me. And so that gives you a sense of it, of just like state and federal prisons were filled with people that had been affected by these guys and had their lives ruined. And as you said, some of these people were charged with drugs and things like that, which is kind of irrelevant to the unconstitutionality of the arrests and the abuses. But what you see in that, I think, and Baynard kind of said this, is this logical extension of policing, but then it's also this other story, is that they were specifically looking at the kind of people that are not believed. So people that are dealing drugs or formerly dealt drugs or alleged to deal drugs, people who had criminal records. And so they really took advantage of that to understand these people wouldn't be sort of believed or would have very little motivation to say anything about it. And then on top of that, though, I think you can sort of look at it as that these were extensions of policing, which was to bust people like this by any means necessary. And so it's not, and that dehumanizing quality, I think, especially for some of the police officers, specifically Jenkins and then Mamadou Gondo, another cop within the unit who were dealing drugs sort of really deep in that world. I think that they maybe perhaps came into the department to deal drugs and to commit crimes, but certainly other officers were moved in that direction by being led by Jenkins, but also being indoctrinated into Baltimore city-style policing, which these people are kind of beneath you, aren't really people you can sort of callously dismiss, set up, harass, do whatever you need to bust them. And then for them, the bust kind of coincided with the ability to rob them. And just the number of people is really astounding. Quite a few have gotten out, but there's so many people in jail because of these guys that are still sitting there.
And Baynard, I know you covered the uprising after Freddie Gray was killed while in police custody. And you were out in the streets a lot. And one of the most interesting things here that popped out of that, of course, was the fact that Jenkins and this guy, Donnie Stepp, who was a bail bondsman, when they said the drugs were flooding the streets because they ransacked the CVS and now they were selling drugs everywhere, it wasn't the folks in the streets who were selling them. It was them. That was just like a total mindfuck.
Yeah, it's almost like when Stepp testified about that in the trial, and then we talked to him about it later, it really almost like flipped Baltimore on its head. The story that everyone had been living with for the couple of years before that, Commissioner Batts at the time blamed the murder spike on these looted drugs. It's not so much that Jenkins was the only person who, I'm sure other people stole and sold drugs, and Jenkins stole them from, at least what he told Stepp, he stole them from people who had already stolen them from the pharmacies. But he shows up at Stepp's house the night that everyone remembers when things were on fire. Things were still burning, and he shows up at Stepp's house with 2 big trash bags full of drugs. As Stepp said, though, there wasn't even that much dope in it. Most of the drugs, one of the real tragedies that we also don't think is these were West Baltimore pharmacies where there are a lot of elderly people who needed their prescriptions that don't get you high and that aren't worth anything unless you have the condition that it's prescribed for. And so, most of the things they were able to sell out of that were Viagra and Cialis to Stepp's Coke customers. And so, whereas Batts said it would keep the city high for a year, it ultimately kept the county hard for a couple of weeks.
That was a great line in the book. but I want you to just, before we move on into the kind of what this larger story tells us all, which I want to get to here as we close, give the viewer a sense of the depth of this, of what exactly happened over these years. It's just incredible how much money they made, how much dope they sold in the streets, how many lies they screwed over. Give us a sense of the depth. Ben, why don't you start and jump to Brandon, and then we'll move into how this looks at the nation.
Sure. And we've got senses. To try to put a start on it is hard. We know from Stepp, he said that Jenkins never was an honest cop. So as Brandon said, there's a sense that maybe he came into the department with the intention of committing crimes. And have been getting new information about some stuff going all the way back to 2005 right now. But we know in 2010, which is the earliest thing for which he's indicted, that they were trying to rob a guy named Umar Burley. And in that case, they jump out with masks on, with guns, lock him in. He tries to flee from them, and they jump in the car and chase him, and that causes a crash that kills a man named Albert Davis, who was the father of a cop. And so it turns out that Burley had nothing on him, and so they call up a sergeant who has an ounce of heroin in his trunk and comes, and they plan an ounce of heroin on this guy. And so he was one who was still in jail almost 8 years later when the indictments come out. So that's one case that he pleaded guilty to that goes all the way back to 2010. And it didn't stop until the day that in 2017 when they were arrested. And the public defender's office here in Maryland thinks that 10,000 cases were compromised. And those are just the cases where arrests were made. There were other times where using government surveillance equipment, government surveillance and materials, federal investigations, they would go and just break into people's houses and rob and steal thousands and thousands of dollars, from dealers that no one would ever know because they'd break in the middle of the night and they'd have a tracker on the car. Gondo and another cop named Rayam worked with Gondo's drug dealing crew in 2015. This is one of the things that helped to bring them down. They thought a guy had $100,000 and some heroin. They were either going to just kill him and take his money or do a fake raid. They decided instead to put a tracker on his car, wait till he was gone, and go in his house and steal all the money and the dope. Turns out his girlfriend, who's a law student, was asleep in the bed. They point a gun at her, say, "Where's the money? I'm going to kill you." And they end up taking, I think, something close to a kilo of heroin and a lot less money than they thought. And they go off and immediately sell the heroin in an old folks' home. And then come, and go back and split up the money. And so these are just small amounts. Very little of the money that they stole was recovered by the federal government. We have some suspicions of where we think some of that might be, but it's crazy that the drug dealers that Gondo was working with, that Brandon mentioned earlier, that they were tapping their phones, which is what led them to the GTTF, that those guys have as much time for their heroin conspiracy as Jenkins and all of the GTTF defendants had. 25 years is what Jenkins got and what Antonia Shropshire had, where Jenkins sold massive amounts of more heroin, broke into people's houses, held people hostage, sent people to prison on false charges. It's just, he ran over a person that they were chasing, fabricated the charges, and had another sergeant come and put a BB gun under the car so they could do that. It's just the different levels of crime, from massive heists to massive drug dealing to just like running people over and stuff. It's hard to say this. It was one of the reasons it was so hard to get it into a narrative, is because it's so big.
It's huge. Ben, do you want to add to that at all before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that, the sort of macro of it, which Baynard started to dig into after these really important sort of isolated incidents that are just terrifying, is, there's the nightly raids they're kind of doing. They're pulling up on people in Baltimore. They had a thing called a door pop, which is basically pull your car up to someone, hit the brakes and pop the door. And as soon as, a bunch of black men sitting at a bus stop hear a car pull up, and also these are unmarked police cars. They're not, they don't have sirens. They hear that door pop, they run. Once people run, it's a justification in their eyes to chase these people and tackle them. They're doing those every night, up to 50 times a night. That was what was testified. And so they're pulling drugs and cash out of people's pockets and guns nightly. And that's the kind of smaller examples that really, really build, that you can't possibly calculate. You don't know how many of those people were actually charged with a crime. You know how many of these people were had those drugs stolen and then had to go back and tell their plug, they're like, hey, these guys ran up and tackled us and took our drugs. You don't know what happens to someone who's down with the counts wrong, the drugs are gone, those kinds of things. That kind of violence you can't really calculate. There's no Johns Hopkins study that can calculate that stuff. So that's really important. And then, as Baynard sort of said, at the same time, you have the massive stuff that by 2016, which is the focus of our book, 3 of these officers all have a connection to a drug dealer. So there's 3 different kind of drug rings running out of these 7 cops. Like, that's just including one that went up to Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. So that's just impossible to comprehend in a way. We can tell the anecdotes, we can put it together in order, but the actually like hard data on how that affected crime is just inexplicable.
So I want to kind of get into something that's the Baltimore's emblematic of that we're facing right now in this country. I mean, with this question of police abolition, defunding the police. You all wrote a really good op-ed in the Washington Post recently called Baltimore Tried Reforming the Police. They Fought Every Change. And in the book, you have everything from Deborah Levy, who is a public defender who comes out as a kind of a real hero in the book in terms of her work and what she does, taking on corrupt police. But she talks about showing corruption between the Baltimore Police Officer Department, the State's Attorney's Office. And I think about the moment we're in and how these things are tied together in terms of how high up the level of corruption actually goes with inside the police department, even though most of the people at the top were not indicted with these guys. But clearly you show a possibility of connections, but we don't know them. And there's a line in your book here, and a line from the piece I want to throw out here, and let's talk about this for a minute. One of the lines in the book is, they're out there right now. They might be busted, but there are more people out there. This is not over. And then in your Washington Post piece, you close with saying, police don't believe in reform. Baltimore shows that we shouldn't either. So let's pick up on what this book is kind of really telling us about this moment we're in, about the depth of corruption and why in the police departments, and what the hell do we do about it from all the work you've done. Who starts? Brandon, we'll start with you and we'll end up with Baynard.
Yeah. So yeah. I mean, thanks for kind of close reading that stuff in the book and in the op-ed. I mean, the book is called "I Got a Monster" because it's something that Sergeant Jenkins said to when he had a big drug deal he wanted to rob. He called them monsters. We sort of explored this monster imagery, especially because it's the kind of imagery that goes back to like the super predator myth of the 90s about black criminals. Or, you know, stories like that. Police shooting victims are just these sort of super strong people that like bullets couldn't take down. That was said about Mike Brown. So it's one of the many ways we're trying to flip this around and use it towards police. And so the monster thing is something that's sort of a theme through the book, but it's also an argument that these guys are true villains, true people to be feared and just be stopped. And so what you really see in the op-ed and in the book is the way that police are going after people and have the power of the state behind them, and at the same time are sort of encouraging them to trying to stop reforms. They're fighting any changes to the department, and that's another thing that like can't be stopped by, I don't know, simple adding more laws or having another panel about policing. Like there's really this concerted, aggressive effort to stop reform, sabotage reform, or exploit reform, as Baynard kind of said, by finding ways to use body cameras and other kind of versions of surveillance to do more of what they wanted to do. They're really devious. Again, there's kind of this, you know, you also have this chase kind of set up in the book where, because there were cops, it's not a cops chasing criminals, it's defense attorneys chasing cops who are dirty. But that idea that like there's a real chase going on, you have to stop these guys before. In the book, and the op-ed kind of stressed that like the removal of even these 7, additionally about 8 or so others have been connected to this, have been federally charged. It doesn't seem to be over. And so the idea is there's that, but then there's just all of the strategy and the tactics that these officers learned and used that other officers are using right now on the streets. I mean, the last thing I'll say is I think that the plainclothes policing element is really important. That's maybe something I was most shocked about, or just embarrassingly naive about the darkness of plainclothes policing, that it's kind of a shadow police force, a shadow army stalking black neighborhoods that white people don't really think about, ready to jump out and throw you against the wall and grab a gun from you and drugs, or plant a gun on you, or plant a gun,
right. You know, and I was thinking about how the title, as soon as I saw the title, I Got a Monster, I thought of the double entendre. And part of it is the monster is, in fact, the pervasiveness of corruption and protection that happens inside those departments, which is why you're basically saying, both of you are saying, reform is not enough.
Yeah, I mean, I specifically with the title, I loved thinking about Oedipus, you know, when he says, I'm going to find the man who killed the king, and he has no idea that it's him. And when Jenkins calls Step at the beginning of the book and says, I got a monster, it's like, yeah, you do, and you don't know how many ways you do. but yeah, I mean, it's crazy. Like we're seeing this happening in Portland now with these federal police agents there, unmarked, snatching people up and stuff. And one of the crazy things that really shocked me and what we discovered with this is that Jenkins and his crew would lie about who they were when they pick up the guy, Ronald Hamilton, that Brendan mentioned earlier, and don't even charge him, take him to his house out of the county, get him at a Home Depot, take him out to the county, never end up charging him and take all his money. They told him that Jenkins told him he was a U.S. attorney. He told the guy in the case that the book starts with that he was the DEA. So you wouldn't know what agency these people were either. And they're in unmarked cars. They're picking you up and you don't know who they are. And I think they're specifically acting as a counterinsurgency in the way that coming in a post-uprising city. They were furious about the uprising. They were furious about the talks of reform. Jenkins called, even before the uprising, the reforms that Commissioner Batts was trying to bring in, gay training, using a slur to try to disparage them while also being homophobic. And this is what we should expect to see around the country now, as people are calling for defunding police departments, abolishing police departments. Police see this as an existential threat, and crime causes us to say we need cops. And you could see that happen in the period of the book. So we start just with a prologue with the uprising after the death of Freddie Gray. But by the time it really starts in March 2016, everyone has given up on most of that. And we're saying we need to get the homicides down. We need to stop the murders, do whatever it takes. The Eric Kowalczyk, who was a spokesperson for the old administration, when Commissioner Davis, who's the commissioner throughout most of the book, comes in, he gets them in the room and says, the riot is over. Do what it takes to get the city under control. And the politicians were doing the same. We had an op-ed in the New York Times a year ago that was in many ways pre-budding Bret Stephens' stupid argument this last week about the Baltimore model, how we're going to cause crime by trying to reform police. It's the police, as Brandon mentioned earlier, all of these things they were doing caused crime in so many ways. They took $10,000 from a guy and arrested him. And when he was coming from his court date, someone else who he owed money to murdered him. And how do we calculate the effect of that on the kinds of crime that's happening in cities right now? And these officers see themselves, these detectives in plainclothes especially, as at war with the city. We need to take their own words seriously when they talk about a war on drugs, when they talk about a war on guns, when they start a war room to gather intelligence. They mean that literally, and we need to start taking it literally too, that they're at war on us. And so the plainclothes squads that see that as their job and that we give the power to do that as their jobs, they are still out there right now, prowling around in unmarked cars, looking for citizens who they think are, as the U.S. Attorney said, beneath the law, and that no one will listen to.
Well, they're above the law. Folks, I got to say, I really highly recommend this book. I Got a Monster, The Rise and Fall of America's Most Corrupt Police Squad. It's an amazing piece of work, really well written, grips and holds you in. It's also important as we face the future of policing and our country, the rise of fascism under Trump, putting federal police in unmarked cars. All these things are connected. And when you read Baynard Woods and Brandon Soderberg's book, I Got a Monster, it comes all falling into place as well. So check it out. And Baynard and Brandon, again, disclosure, we are friends, but the book is really, really good. So I want to thank you both for writing this book and for joining us here on The Real News today. It's an important piece of work.
Thanks so much for having us, brother.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Always good to see you all, even at a distance. And I'm Mark Steiner here for The Real News Network. Thank you all for joining us. Let us know what you think, and take care.